Galactic aliens condemned their deadly wolves until a human stepped and tells the tale of a vast and intricate universe filled with cosmic wonders and civilizations stretching across the stars. The narrative unfolds in a future where humankind is not the dominant force in the galaxy. In fact, humanity is considered a relatively young species compared to the ancient, highly advanced civilizations that have flourished for millennia. Alien empires, mighty and vast, dominate entire star systems, their cultures steeped in technologies far beyond the comprehension of Earth's best minds. For centuries, an alliance of alien species had worked together to maintain order and peace within the galaxy. But despite their shared purpose, there was an ancient, unresolved issue that had kept certain alien races in constant conflict. It revolved around a singular and particularly deadly species of predator, the wolves. To the advanced galactic civilizations, these wolves were the stuff of nightmares. Aggressive, highly intelligent, and bred for hunting, they were far more dangerous than any creature the galaxy had encountered. These wolves, however, were not merely a dangerous species in the natural sense. They were known to be capable of entire coordinated assaults, capable of wiping out entire colonies and entire fleets of alien ships. Even with their superior technology and weaponry, many alien species found themselves at a loss when it came to effectively combating these formidable beasts. For eons, the wolves were a source of terror, with many planets declaring the wolves as their greatest enemies. Most races viewed them as little more than vicious, heartless predators that needed to be eradicated at all costs. With this overwhelming consensus, a universal decree was made: the wolves must be hunted down and condemned to extinction. The leaders of every major alien faction agreed, and operations to annihilate the wolves began in earnest. At first, the efforts were brutal but effective. Each alien race, with their highly advanced technologies, launched massive campaigns against the wolves. They deployed fleets of warships, armed with energy weapons capable of eradicating entire forests and habitats in mere moments. Entire planets were purged of any sign of the wolves' existence, leaving only smoldering ruins in their wake. However, despite these efforts, the wolves refused to be wiped out. They were resilient, adapting to every attack, finding new ways to survive and thrive in even the most hostile environments. And so, as time wore on, the alien forces found themselves locked in an unending war of attrition with these relentless predators. It became apparent that the wolves were not going to go down easily or at all. The galaxy's collective frustration reached its peak when the wolves began to learn, adapt, and grow even more dangerous. Many alien species had hoped that the extermination of the wolves would be quick and decisive, but what they found instead was that their weapons were ineffective against the wolves' cunning and endurance. Every new weapon or strategy the aliens developed to defeat them seemed to be countered by the wolves in ways that no one had anticipated. They even started to appear in places they should have never been able to survive, from the darkest reaches of space to the most hostile worlds, creating chaos wherever they went. In their desperation, the galactic empires turned to ancient and dangerous means of extermination, setting traps in deep space, using planet-busting weapons, and unleashing biological agents that would render entire ecosystems uninhabitable. Still, the wolves endured. It was a relentless cycle of war and terror, one that seemed impossible to break. Eventually, the aliens began to question their own methods. Some wondered if the galaxy was truly capable of eradicating these beasts, while others began to consider more extreme solutions. Yet none of their efforts succeeded in wiping out the wolves. But there was something the galactic empires hadn't counted on: an unforeseen variable, something no one had anticipated. Amid the darkness of this war, a mere human, stepped into the fray. The human, whose name was Ethan Cruz, was a man with little regard for the bureaucratic entanglements of the galactic empires. He wasn't a member of any powerful race, nor did he come from a rich or influential family. He was just an ordinary man, born on Earth, who had somehow found his way into the sprawling reaches of galactic space. Ethan had heard the legends of the wolves, their terror and destruction, the fears they instilled in all who faced them. He had heard the stories of civilizations ravaged by these creatures, and how the most powerful forces in the galaxy had been unable to stop them. Ethan wasn't a soldier, nor was he a scientist. He was a pilot, a man who spent his time flying ships across the stars, carrying out various trade and transport missions for clients who needed his skills. But when he found himself on a planet facing the wolves, his perception of reality changed forever. It wasn't supposed to be his fight. Ethan had no stake in the war between the alien empires and the wolves. His only concern had been delivering cargo from one side of the galaxy to the other. Yet fate had a different plan in mind. He had arrived on a world near the border of a war zone where the wolves had been wreaking havoc for decades. It was a desolate, dangerous place, a planet scarred by countless battles. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the skies were always shrouded in a foreboding cloud of smoke. Ethan had delivered his cargo, but when the time came to leave, disaster struck. His ship was damaged, and he found himself trapped on this cursed world. He could see the massive wolf-like creatures prowling the area, their glowing eyes scanning for prey. At first, Ethan tried to escape. He attempted to use his pilot skills to make contact with the local authorities, hoping they could send a rescue ship. But the communication systems were down, and it seemed like his situation was growing worse by the minute. That's when he stumbled upon something he had not expected to see: a group of aliens who had been stranded just like him. These aliens were not soldiers or warriors, they were civilians, refugees, living in the ruins of the city that once stood proudly on this planet. They were weak, frightened, and utterly powerless against the wolves. Ethan's instinct kicked in. He didn't know what to do at first, but he knew one thing: if he didn't act fast, they were all going to die. He wasn't a warrior, but he had grown up in a world where survival was paramount. He had learned from a young age that sometimes you couldn't just wait for help. Sometimes you had to take matters into your own hands. For hours, Ethan fought against the wolves, using every trick he knew to stay one step ahead. He used his knowledge of the terrain, his survival skills, and his resourcefulness to set traps and outmaneuver the wolves. It was exhausting work, but as the hours passed, something incredible happened. Ethan began to understand the wolves, to see their patterns and behaviors. He began to recognize their weaknesses, not in terms of technology or weaponry, but in terms of instincts and psychology. The wolves were not just mindless beasts, they were predators, highly intelligent, capable of strategy and planning. But they were also creatures of habit. And as Ethan observed them more closely, he realized that there were ways to outthink them, to exploit their nature. He started using the environment to his advantage, luring the wolves into carefully laid traps, using their own instincts against them. He didn't need advanced weapons or technology. He needed his mind, his wit, and his ability to outsmart them. In time, Ethan's efforts started to bear fruit. He killed several wolves, using nothing but his wits and his makeshift weapons. The refugees, seeing the humans' success, began to follow his lead. Together, they started to fight back. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but they began to make progress. Ethan became a symbol of hope, a figure who represented the possibility of survival against overwhelming odds. His ability to think beyond the technology and brute force that the alien races relied on made him a beacon of inspiration for those who had given up. Soon, word of Ethan's success spread. First, it was the small community of refugees, then it was the surrounding outposts and settlements. And as the message reached the galactic powers, a new realization began to dawn. The wolves, once thought to be invincible, could be defeated by a species that had never been considered a threat. A species that didn't have the advanced technology, the fleets, or the armies, a species that relied on its mind and ingenuity to survive. Humanity, once considered nothing more than an insignificant speck in the galaxy, had just proven that they could do what no one else could. They could outthink the wolves, outmaneuver them, and eventually drive them into extinction. This human, Ethan Cruz, had done what entire galactic empires had failed to achieve. And in doing so, he had rewritten the rules of warfare in the galaxy. The galactic empires, watching in disbelief, realized that the age of their superiority was over. The humans, with their adaptability, ingenuity, and determination, had become a force to be reckoned with. It was no longer just the wolves that the galaxy had to fear. Now, it was the humans, the species that had once been considered a mere curiosity that would change the fate of the stars forever. The war with the wolves was not yet won, but with the humans stepping in, the future of the galaxy had been irrevocably altered. The balance of power had shifted, and a new chapter had begun in the history of the galaxy. As Ethan Cruz continued to guide the ragtag group of refugees, the war with the wolves took on a new shape. The once terrifying creatures, once believed to be beyond the reach of the galaxy's finest, now found themselves facing a foe unlike any other. A foe that didn't rely on brute strength or advanced technology, but instead on the instincts and cleverness of a species that had survived by adapting to its environment. And as the days wore on, it became clear that the wolves were beginning to falter. Ethan's strategies, initially met with skepticism, were beginning to show their worth. The wolves, accustomed to their own tactics of terror, were struggling to counter the human ingenuity. Ethan had learned to turn every environment to his advantage, from the dense forests where the wolves' keen senses of smell were offset by clever misdirection, to the rocky canyons where his team had set up traps that used the terrain to crush the predators. His mind was a weapon far more dangerous than any laser cannon, and his ability to think several steps ahead was becoming legendary. But Ethan knew that this success was only the beginning. The wolves were relentless, and even with the ingenuity he and the refugees had displayed, there was still a long way to go before they could consider the threat neutralized. There were too many wolves scattered across too many planets, and every victory they won on one world only seemed to make the wolves adapt and evolve more rapidly. It wasn't just about surviving now, it was about finding a way to truly eradicate them, once and for all. The refugees, despite their initial disbelief, had become a small, but hardened, army. Under Ethan's guidance, they had learned how to fight back with the same determination and cunning that had made humanity such a successful species on Earth. No longer just bystanders in this galactic struggle, they had taken up arms, setting traps, laying ambushes, and slowly but surely turning the tide of battle. It was then that something truly remarkable happened. A high-ranking emissary from one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, the Verithians, appeared in the refugee camp where Ethan had set up his operations. The Verithians were known across the galaxy for their technological prowess and vast intelligence networks. They had been part of the coalition that had initially decreed the extermination of the wolves, and their fleets had once been the first to engage in the war. Their commander, Lyrak, was a towering figure in galactic politics, a being of immense stature and even greater intellect. But despite his great accomplishments, Lyrak knew something he wasn't willing to admit: the galactic forces, with all their advanced weaponry and technological superiority, had been failing. The wolves had outsmarted them, evaded their greatest attempts, and simply refused to be beaten. Lyrak had come to a conclusion that shook his world. Perhaps it was not the advanced technology that would win this war, but something else entirely. It was the humans. The Verithians, though not without their own form of arrogance, had realized that what Ethan Cruz had done could not be ignored. He had done the impossible. While the other alien races tried to brute force their way through the conflict, humanity's greatest weapon was their minds. They had something the galaxy's oldest civilizations had forgotten: adaptability. Where others had relied on rigid methods, humans had learned to evolve. And this, Lyrak believed, could be the key to finally defeating the wolves. He proposed an alliance. His fleet, equipped with the most advanced technologies, would provide the necessary support, but they would not lead the fight. No, this battle was Ethan's. It was humanity's battle now. At first, Ethan hesitated. The humans had always been considered weak, insignificant in the grand scheme of the galaxy. Would they truly be able to stand side by side with such an advanced species? But then, looking around at the ragtag survivors who had trusted him and fought under his command, Ethan realized something. They had done the impossible together. And now, with the full backing of a galactic power, they could push even further, beyond what any of them could have dreamed. Together, Ethan and the Verithian forces began to formulate a new strategy. They would not fight as they had before, using brute force or overwhelming numbers. No, this would be a battle of minds. They would learn everything they could about the wolves, their behavior, their biology, their tactics, and use that knowledge to outmaneuver them once and for all. The Varithians, with their vast intelligence networks, began to scour the galaxy, finding any and all information they could about the wolves' origins, their evolutionary paths, and their weaknesses. Meanwhile, Ethan and his team used their guerrilla tactics to learn firsthand how the wolves fought, where they could be cornered, and where their natural instincts betrayed them. Months passed, and as the alliance between humanity and the Varithians grew stronger, so did their understanding of the wolves. What they discovered was staggering. The wolves were not just a random species of predators. They were part of something much larger and ancient, galactic force that had been designed to serve a darker purpose. They were not merely creatures of instinct, but were being controlled, manipulated by an unseen hand. And this hand, they soon realized, was far older and more dangerous than any of the species in the galaxy could have imagined. The wolves were a weapon, the living, breathing weapon designed by a mysterious race known as the Zothar, an ancient empire that had once ruled the galaxy eons ago. The Zothar had disappeared long before any of the current galactic civilizations had risen to power, but their legacy had endured in the form of the wolves, genetically engineered to be the perfect predator, capable of laying waste to entire planets. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Alliance. What they had thought was a simple battle for survival was now something much darker. The wolves weren't just beasts of nature, they were tools, part of an ancient, twisted plan. And now, with this new knowledge, Ethan's team and the Varithians began to realize that defeating the wolves would be only the first step in a far greater war. The Zothar had been gone for millennia, but their creations, the wolves, still lingered. And if they could control such a devastating weapon, what other horrors might the Zothar have left behind? The galaxy was no longer a safe place for anyone. The wolves were just the beginning. The galaxy's inhabitants now had two options. They could either continue the war against the wolves, or they could band together to unravel the mystery of the Zothar and their ultimate goal. Ethan, ever the pragmatic survivor, chose the latter. He knew that the war with the wolves was far from over, but the true enemy was yet to be fully understood. And so, as Ethan stood alongside the Varithian emissary, preparing for the next phase of the war, a new reality dawned. They were no longer just fighting for survival. Now, they were fighting for the future of the galaxy itself. But what neither Ethan nor the Varithians could have anticipated was the revelation that would come next, that the Zothar were not truly gone. And they were watching. Waiting. And they had been for a very long time. The revelation that the Zothar were not truly gone sent a ripple of dread through the entire galaxy. It was no longer just a war against wolves. It was a battle for the survival of every sentient species across the stars, and a race to unravel the deep, ancient web that had been woven long before any of them had come into existence. The knowledge that the Zothar race that had wielded power beyond comprehension were still lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting, was a chilling thought for even the most battle-hardened warriors. Ethan Cruz and the Varithian emissary, Lyrak, now stood at the heart of an alliance that stretched across the galaxy. The refugees who had fought alongside Ethan had become something far more than survivors. They had become the nucleus of a resistance, a beacon of hope for others who had witnessed the terror of the wolves and the strange, unsettling presence of the Zothar's influence. But even as they planned their next steps, the questions loomed large. How had the Zothar survived the eons of their presumed extinction? What was their endgame? And perhaps most troubling of all, were the wolves their only weapon, or was there something more? The Alliance convened in a massive galactic council, a virtual meeting room that existed in the vastness of space, capable of connecting the most distant worlds. The council was made up of representatives from the Varithians, humans, and the various other species who had thrown in their lot with Ethan's cause. They discussed strategies for countering the wolves, sharing intel, and collaborating on the science needed to defeat them once and for all. However, the shadow of the Zothar loomed over every decision. No one could ignore the possibility that the wolves were merely the first act in a much grander and more terrifying plan. The conversation turned to the possibility of a strike against the heart of the Zothar's power. The Verithians, with their advanced technology and vast intelligence networks, had been researching the ancient archives, hoping to uncover more about the Zothar and their empire. What they discovered was a trail, a faint one, but a trail nonetheless. Ancient ruins had been found scattered across the galaxy, remnants of a time long past. These ruins, though broken and decayed, were still imbued with the advanced technologies that had once made the Zothar a galactic superpower. The most significant discovery was a set of coordinates, buried deep within a collection of ancient texts. These coordinates led to a distant system, far beyond the reach of most known spacefaring races. It was there, the records indicated, that the Zothar had constructed their final stronghold, a place where they had sealed away their ultimate weapon. The coordinates had been encoded in such a way that only those with the right knowledge could decipher them. But now, with the combined efforts of human ingenuity and Verithian intelligence, they had cracked the code. Ethan, along with Lyrak and a small group of elite operatives, was selected to lead an expedition to this distant system. The mission was clear: find the Zothar stronghold and, if possible, destroy it. But the risks were immense. It was entirely possible that the Zothar had laid traps to ensure their continued dominance, and no one knew for certain what awaited them in that unknown sector of space. As the mission was being prepared, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. He had faced countless dangers in his life, from the brutal attacks of the wolves to the treacherous and cold-hearted politics of the Galactic Council. But this was different. The Zothar were a force unlike any he had ever encountered. And yet, despite the fears that gnawed at him, Ethan felt a strange sense of resolve. The galaxy needed him. The refugees needed him. And humanity, for all its youthful vulnerability, had become a symbol of resistance, of hope. The journey to the Zothar stronghold took them to the edge of known space. As they entered the uncharted sector, the stars seemed to grow dimmer, the void stretching before them like an impenetrable sea. The ship, a sleek Verithian vessel equipped with the best technology available, glided silently through the darkness, its engines barely making a sound. Ethan stood at the command center, watching as the stars blurred into streaks of light around them. "We're nearing the coordinates," Lyrak's voice broke through the quiet hum of the ship's systems. The Verithian commander's tone was calm, but there was an edge of tension beneath it. Even he, with all his experience and knowledge, could not suppress the unease that was creeping into his mind. Ethan nodded, trying to mask the tension he felt. The crew of the ship, a mix of humans, Verithians, and a few other species who had volunteered for this perilous mission, were all on edge. They knew what was at stake. The wolves had already shown the galaxy the depths of their ferocity, and the Zothar, it seemed, had a far darker purpose. The first signs of the Zothar stronghold appeared like a faint flicker in the distance. At first, it seemed like just another anomaly in the vast expanse of space. But as they got closer, it became clear that this was no natural phenomenon. The structure was massive, a sprawling network of artificial constructs, seemingly alive, pulsing with a dark energy that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. This was no ordinary space station or military base. This was something far older and far more sinister. The ship's sensors flickered, and Lyrak's voice came through again, this time more urgent. "There's a massive energy field surrounding the stronghold. We'll need to find a way through it. But this is no ordinary shield, it's unlike anything we've ever seen before." Ethan didn't hesitate. "We'll find a way. We have to." As the ship drew closer, the energy field surrounding the stronghold began to shimmer and pulse. It was as though the very fabric of reality itself was being bent and twisted. Ethan felt a chill race down his spine, and even Lyrak, usually composed and stoic, seemed unnerved. They approached the heart of the structure, and as they did, the ship's systems went haywire. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the once calm atmosphere turned tense. The ship began to lurch, and Ethan grabbed the nearest console, steadying himself as the vessel shook. "We've broken through," one of the crew members shouted. "We're inside." The ship shuddered as it passed through the final barrier, emerging into the heart of the Zothar stronghold. What lay before them was beyond anything they could have imagined. The massive, alien architecture stretched out in every direction, vast and incomprehensible. At the center of it all was a glowing, pulsating core, the source of the immense energy that had been radiating from the structure. It was as though the stronghold itself was alive, breathing, watching them. And then, just as Ethan and the others began to take in the magnitude of what they had discovered, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, and the shadows in the corners of the vast chamber seemed to come alive. The Zothar were here. The true battle for the galaxy had just begun. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through Ethan's bones, a low, sinister frequency that seemed to reverberate in the very fabric of space. The air in the chamber thickened, as though the atmosphere itself was being charged with some ancient, malevolent power. Ethan's eyes darted around the vast space, the walls stretching high into infinity. This wasn't just a structure, it was a tomb, a living monument to something far older and far more dangerous than anything the galaxy had ever known. "We're not alone," Lyrak said, his voice tight with a growing sense of realization. His long, angular eyes scanned the environment as his soldiers prepared weapons, their hands trembling ever so slightly. A flicker of movement caught Ethan's attention. Shadows swirled in the corners of the room, whispering and undulating like dark liquid. The energy pulse from the core intensified, and suddenly, the shadows coalesced into something solid. They were figures tall, thin, and humanoid, but with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to distort in unnatural ways. The Zothar, in their true form, had arrived. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, instinctively drawing his sidearm. The humans, Verithians, and other allies began to fan out, weapons raised, but their readiness felt like a futile defense against a force beyond their understanding. "You've come far, humans," a voice echoed, deep and reverberating, coming from the very walls of the chamber itself. It wasn't a voice they could attribute to any of the Zothar figures before them. It was as though the words came from the structure itself, an ancient, imperceptible intelligence embedded in the bones of the stronghold. Ethan's gaze locked with Lyrak's. The Verithian commander's face had grown pale, and the usual composure he wore was gone. His people had steadied the Zothar, but now that they were face to face with them, even he wasn't prepared for the sheer magnitude of their presence. "Who are you?" Lyrak demanded, his voice steady, though his body radiated tension. "What have you done with the galaxy? Why did you create the wolves?" The response came not from the humanoid figures standing in front of them, but from the very structure itself. The ground trembled again, and the core pulsated brighter, casting an eerie, unnatural light across the chamber. The walls of the stronghold began to crack, revealing glyphs and symbols, ancient runes that glowed faintly in the dark. "We are the Zothar," the voice rumbled again, now filled with a strange sense of calm. "We were the architects of creation, and the builders of destruction. We did not create the wolves, they were born of necessity. A species forged to serve, to test the galaxy's mettle. They were our instruments, our first step. But you humans are different. You have shown resilience, adaptability, and intelligence beyond even what we anticipated." A silence fell over the chamber as the words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking in. Ethan's mind raced. The wolves, those deadly, nearly unstoppable predators, were mere tools created by the Zothar to test the galaxy's readiness for something greater. The realization hit Ethan with full force. They had never been fighting just for survival, they had been part of a larger, unimaginable game. Lyrak clenched his fists, his sharp eyes narrowing. "What do you want from us? We're not your pawns." The Zothar figures tilted their heads in eerie synchronization, their glowing eyes reflecting an intelligence far older than anything the galaxy had ever encountered. "You are not pawns. You are the next evolution," the voice boomed again, its tone now almost affectionate, as though speaking to children with great promise. "The galaxy is old, and we have watched as civilizations rise and fall. We created the wolves to challenge your strengths, to make you better. But you, humans, you have impressed us. You are the seed of the next step in our design." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mind struggled to process the implications. They weren't just facing a threat. The Zothar weren't simply seeking to dominate, they were trying to shape the future. To elevate humanity, but also, undoubtedly, to control it. The Zothar spoke again, their form shimmering and shifting, as if their bodies were not entirely bound by the laws of reality. We have watched you grow. The wolves are just the first test. The next phase will be your true challenge. You have the potential to become our new heirs, our successors. But you must prove yourselves worthy. A ripple of horror spread through Ethan's chest. The Zothar wanted to ascend humanity, but only on their terms. To be part of their plan, their twisted legacy of creation and destruction. Ethan stepped forward, his voice shaking with fury and resolve. We don't want to be your heirs. We don't want your power. We're not your playthings to shape or destroy. We'll fight you. The room seemed to pause, the air heavy with tension. The Zothar were silent for a moment, studying Ethan as if pondering his words. Finally, the voice returned, cold and unyielding. You misunderstand. You have no choice. The game has already begun. We will either guide you to greatness or watch as you falter and fall, as all others before you have. You will either join us or be swept aside by the wolves you have already begun to defeat. The Zothar figures shifted again, their long limbs sweeping through the air as though conducting an unseen orchestra. Suddenly, the ground beneath Ethan's feet began to tremble once more, and the chamber was filled with an overwhelming energy. Ethan felt a sharp pressure in his chest as if the very fabric of reality were closing in on him. Then, the core at the center of the stronghold flared to life. The ground buckled, and Ethan's eyes widened as he saw what was emerging from the core, an enormous, serpentine creature, its body pulsing with dark energy. Its eyes, glowing with a dreadful intelligence, locked onto him, and the air around them seemed to crackle with power. The Zothar's final weapon. Now you will understand the true cost of your defiance, the voice whispered, now seeming almost satisfied. This is the trial. Survive, and you may find a place in our future. Fail, and the galaxy will fall under the shadow of our creation. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the creature loomed closer, its enormous form casting a shadow that threatened to swallow everything in its path. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for humanity's freedom, for the galaxy's future. And whatever it took, Ethan Cruz wasn't about to let the Zothar have their way. With a roar, he raised his weapon, signaling the others. The battle had only just begun.